Hello! So in the peer reviews, I noticed a sort of widespread mix-up or confusion between the rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos, and the rhetorical methods of development. In general, if confusion is widespread, that means it's not a problem with you, but a problem for me to fix as your instructor, since it's my responsibility to convey key course concepts, and if they have not been conveyed properly, that is my fault. Alright, so what are the rhetorical methods of development? There are a variety of strategies employed to explore, expand, and organize ideas. We're already subconsciously using these methods as ways to make sense of the world, even if we don't realize it, which I guess is what subconsciously means, so that was redundant. But whenever we figure out what we want to say and what context we want to situate that in, we're using one or more of the rhetorical methods of development. So just as much as we use them to figure out how to convey our own ideas, we also use them as templates for interpreting what someone else is communicating. Just as much as we use them to figure out how to convey our own ideas, we also use them as templates for interpreting what someone else is communicating to us. There are a total of 9 rhetorical methods of development. Some of them you're probably already familiar with, even though you might not know them as rhetorical methods of development. So they are definition, classification and division, comparison and contrast, exemplification, process analysis, cause and effect analysis, narration, description, and argument. Each method could be used on its own, but they more often than not overlap or complement one another as we attempt to understand and convey ideas. I'm going to go through each one, and I'm going to split them up into 3 categories: methods of defining, methods of explaining, and methods of showing or convincing. Fittingly enough, the first method of defining is definition. The other 2 are classification and division, and comparison and contrast. So definition is a classification that distinguishes, describes, and names something. And there are a lot of kinds of definitions. So there are formal or sentence definitions, which are a dictionary or encyclopedia reference that classifies, describes, and names something. So those are the sort of definition that you're most familiar with. And then there's extended definition, which is a more in-depth classification that provides extended information to describe, distinguish, and name something. So something like a Wikipedia entry might be an extended definition. And then a historical definition, which is an overview over a period of time of how a concept or term has been used, or how something has changed or evolved over time that falls under that name. And then negative definition is used to clarify for readers not only what a term means, but also what it does not mean. So, for example, a consonant is any letter that is not a vowel. A stipulative definition is a classification which limits or stipulates the range of a term's meaning or application, thereby announcing to the reader exactly how the writer is using the term in this specific rhetorical situation. So, for example, you might have a term that means something different in physics than it does in computer science, and so you would provide a stipulative definition that distinguishes it. Say you're using the computer science version, you would provide a stipulative definition that distinguishes it from the physics definition by saying, by which I mean, and then that definition, and not the physics definition. If you want to learn about linear algebra in a way that's actually interesting and exciting, there are a lot of good YouTube videos. The next method of defining is classification and division. So that's the act of creating categories that distinguish information, objects, or other concepts. So it first places something in a general category and then distinguishes it from other things within that category. So when you use classification and division, you provide a term and then place that term in its general category of origin. So a simple example would be, you're all Penn State freshmen, meaning you're part of the general category of Penn State students, and then you're distinguished from other students in that category when we subdivide that category by year into freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. Another example would be something like a library, right? Libraries are broken up into sections: periodicals, fiction, nonfiction, children's books, digital media, etc. And then those sections are further subdivided, like fiction is subdivided into subgenres of like fantasy or historical fiction, and then nonfiction is also divided into subgenres like history, biography, science books, etc. And then there are even subdivisions within those subdivisions. And then those sections are subdivided, right, by the last name of the author, and then so on and so forth. Then finally, comparison and contrast, you're probably familiar with. It's a method used to describe similarities and differences. We use comparison to consider how two or more things are alike, and we use contrast to show how related things are different. The methods of explaining are exemplification, process analysis, and cause and effect analysis. So exemplification is when you make a generalization and then use an example or series of examples in support of that generalization. For example, you already use this method in your rhetorical analysis assignment when you used examples from the text you were analyzing to prove your general points about that text. Process analysis is dividing up an entire process into a series of ordered steps so that your audience can understand the relationship among those steps and maybe even replicate them. So process analysis always includes a series of separate chronological steps that provide details about a process and often reads like a narration. You might use process analysis to inform, to entertain, or to argue a point. A process analysis is a response to someone needing to know how to do something or wanting to learn how something is done. And there are two types of process analysis: directive process analysis and informative process analysis. In a directive process analysis, it's going to be a series of steps used to teach an audience how to duplicate the occurrence of something. So this is things like instructions, recipes, CPR posters. And then an informative process analysis is a series of steps to explain how something occurs or has occurred. It explains a process so that the audience can understand, enjoy, or be persuaded. So like a water cycle, the chart of the water cycle would be an informative process analysis, because you're not going to duplicate the water cycle, but you might want to know how it works. Or how a bill becomes a law. I think it'd be great if you ran for office, but you might not. But still good to know, right? And then the New Harper's Guide gives the example of a suspense novel that describes the process of matching fingerprints in a criminal investigation. So that's like to entertain. All right, next, cause and effect analysis is an explanation for how some things have occurred, or a prediction that certain events will lead to specific effects. So like, this happened because that happened, or this will happen if you do that. It allows you to use words to address your questions, to explore why some things happen, or predict the effects of an event or situation. You can use cause and effect analysis to explain, to entertain, to speculate, or to argue a point. And then finally, our third category, methods of showing and or convincing. Those are narration, description, and argument. So narration is a detailed account of events as in a story. So narration tells a story that has characters, the people in the story, dialogue, direct speech by the characters, a setting, that's the time and place, description, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and plot, which is the sequence of events. So narration can frame an entire story, or it can provide an example or support an argument. It might consist of one particular sequence of events or include a series of separate incidents that shape an overall narrative. You can use narration to supply information, explain, provide an example, set a mood, or argue a point. Next is description. So this is the convergence of specific details in a verbal accounting of what we have experienced physically and mentally. So descriptions are made up of either sensory details or sensibility details. Sensory details have to do with our physical sensations. So what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. I'm going to be a little self-indulgent now with some literary examples for sensory and sensibility details. So here's the one for sensory details. It's from the short story The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde, which I highly recommend. I recommend Oscar Wilde in general. Very funny, very good. So, far away in a little street there is a poor house. One of the windows is open, and through it I can see a woman seated at a table. Her face is thin and worn, and she has coarse red hands, all pricked by the needle, for she is a seamstress. In a bed in the corner of the room, her little boy is lying ill. He has a fever and is asking for oranges. His mother has nothing to give him but river water, so he is crying. So here's a lot of sensory description of what the Happy Prince sees, and then also like sounds, little boy is crying, things like that. And then, so sensibility details have to do with our intellectual, emotional, or physical states. So things like alertness, gullibility, grief, fear, loathing, clumsiness, relaxation, etc. So our literary example is from The Plague by Albert Camus, which I am currently reading and also highly recommend. From the title and subject matter, you would think now would be maybe not the best or even a depressing time to read it, but it's actually very comforting. I highly recommend it. You can get it for like $17 or like $12 on Kindle. There's like a 99-cent version. Don't buy that one, it's bad. Alright. It was undoubtedly the feeling of exile, that sensation of a void within which never left us, that irrational longing to hark back to the past or else to speed up the march of time, and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire. Therefore, they forced themselves never to think about the problematic day of escape, to cease looking to the future, and always to keep, so to speak, their eyes fixed on the ground at their feet. And then also quite often, though, I know we're separating them here to define them, but, which is itself a rhetorical method of development, right? But quite often, sensory details and sensibility details will be presented together in a description. So another literary example is the closing of an essay, also by Camus, called The Myth of Sisyphus, that combines both. So, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. All right, so I'm done with self-indulgent examples now. All right, so finally, argument. This is our final method of showing and or convincing, and also our final method of rhetorical development. All right, so argument is the presentation of a point of view in an effort to persuade an audience that something is true or valid. An argument consists of several elements: an identifiable issue, a claim, common ground, and rhetorical appeals. So an identifiable issue is a specific issue related to a problem that can be argued for or against. And then a claim is an arguable position you take regarding that issue. And then common ground is the goal, belief, value, or assumption that you share with your audience. Establishing common ground assures your audience that despite any misunderstandings or disagreements, you both actually share a good deal in common, which provides a starting point for you to speak or write to persuade them. And then you know what the rhetorical appeals are. All right, that's actually it. That's rhetorical methods of development. I hope this cleared things up. Coming soon, the second proposal argument lecture. Have a good day.